skin the fillet like this. First of all, you'd start off cutting the belly flap off. That's where a lot of the toxins accumulate.
With the better weather ahead and fish ready to bite, there are some people who actually eat some of the fish that most others would just throw back into the river. We'll meet some people who have their own thoughts about that and those dreaded PCBs when we come back right here on the river. An estimated 500,000 pounds of PCBs, those polychlorinated biphenyls, are sitting at the bottom of the Hudson River. This is a class of toxic industrial oil that's suspected of causing cancer. Most of it, if not all of it, is north of Troy. As we've told so often, the PCBs have had a negative effect on the aquatic life in the river, causing some to become contaminated and unedible. Steve Stanne, Education Director for the Clearwater Organization, has coordinated a series of programs about the pros and cons of fishing in the river. This program at the Mid-Hudson Arts and Science Center in Poughkeepsie was the third in a four-part series. It dealt specifically with the types of Hudson River fish that are healthy to eat and ways to trim away some of those PCBs.
The program on fishing is one of many other series of programs we offer dealing with all sorts of aspects of Hudson River ecology, natural history. A lot of people, their only contact with the river is driving across it on their way to work, Mid-Hudson Bridge, 8 o'clock in the morning or on their way home. And they don't realize that that river going beneath them is an incredibly productive ecosystem. And if they think about it at all, they think about it in terms of the stories of pollution and PCBs, Westway, all these things that they don't really want to think about. But in fact, the reason that people are fighting to get the PCBs out of the river, they're fighting Westway, is that the river is a very productive system. There's 140 species of fish out there. There's a rich tradition of industry that is very industry where people took advantage of the resources of the river in sort of a benign way, the shad fishery, making use of the renewable resources in the river. And we want to give them a sense of that rich tradition and of the productivity of the river.
Steve says so far the public response to these programs has been good.
This series and the ones that are to come this spring are part of actually it's the fourth year of what we call our Hudson River Community Education Program, which has been funded by the Hudson River Foundation. We offer field trips to the marshes along the river, boat trips, not on the Clearwater, but on other boats as well. Matter of fact, in May, we'll be having a trip to go out and observe shad fishermen at work. This will be on the Roundout Bell out of Kingston. One of the crew of the fishermen will be on the boat to explain what's going on. You'll get to see them put the net out, shoot the net, as they say, and pull it back in, hopefully with a lot of shad. We also do lectures on the history of the river, on some of the issues, on scientific research being done on the river, and on fishing, which is one of our most popular series. Actually, a lot of people like to get out there with a rod and reel and try their luck.
Steve's interest towards the river is not new. His background, he says, includes many years of intense research.
I came to Clearwater 6 years ago and started working on the Clearwater as an educator then. Spent 3 years there and then came into the office. My training for that was both formal and on my own. I have a master's degree in environmental education, but a lot of what I learned came at my father's knee when I was out fishing, trout fishing actually with him. I took an interest in the fish, and at the age of 12 was reading tomes on fisheries management, and got interested in teaching about natural history, birds, plants, fish, the whole gamut. And so moved into environmental education as a career, and I've been doing it for 12 years now, and expect I will be for a few years yet.
Steve says pollution is not the major problem facing the river today.
Well, I see more and more use of the river. It doesn't take a crystal ball to see that there's more boats out there, that riverfront property is becoming more and more valuable every day. Some of the issues we face these days are not so much with pollution in the river, but with development along the river, and whether people will be able to gain access to the river to enjoy it in the way that they have in the past. But those are the sorts of problems that, in a sense, we like to have. People are now starting to take an interest in the river as a place to swim, as a place to go boating, as a place to go hiking, as a place for picnicking, as a place to have a house. And since the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, there's been a lot of improvement, mainly in sewage pollution, decreases in the amount of sewage going into the river. The stuff that remains, the toxics like PCBs, you can't see, and so they're less visible to the eye. And it's going to take a little more work to get them out, better enforcement of the laws that exist to control that pollution. Right now, those laws, Clearwater fields, are not being well enforced.
Cara Lee is the environmental director of Scenic Hudson. We've talked with her before. She explains it depends on who you are as to whether or not it would be safe to eat fish from the Hudson.
Unfortunately, like many questions in life, there is not a clear black and white answer to that. And we have to take into account a lot of different things when we consider for ourselves whether we want to eat fish from the Hudson River. Because it varies somewhat from person to person, and it varies from fish species to fish species. Well, if it varies that much, it seems like it's probably kind of an overwhelming decision. But in fact, there are some generalizations that can be made that help you decide, are you a person who wants to eat fish from the Hudson, and is this a type of fish that you want to eat? And one of the things that people need to consider is how the Department of Health puts together their health advisory. And their health advisory is put together in a very conservative way to protect people in the population who are most vulnerable to the chemicals that you might get from eating contaminated fish. So one of the things maybe we need to do is back up and say, well, why even ask the question, can you eat the fish? Well, the Hudson for many years has been used as a sluiceway, really, for washing away industrial discharges. And we also have, in addition to discharges that are permitted and allowed by the state, we have some remnant problems in the Hudson that mean that we have a chemical contamination problem. The one that most people have heard about is PCBs. We also have a problem further downriver with cadmium pollution that's left over from a battery factory that operated in Cold Spring. And we have probably one of the worst cadmium contamination problems in the world in the Hudson River in Cold Spring. So those are two contamination problems that make the question, can you eat the fish, a relevant question. When health advisories are designed, they're designed to protect the most vulnerable people in the population. And the people who are considered most vulnerable are children and women who are of childbearing age. And the reason for that is probably pretty clear, that children are smaller, so that a smaller dose of some chemical might be more dangerous for them, and they're not fully developed. And some of these chemicals, we don't know what their impact could be on a child's development. The same is true for women of childbearing age. Since some of these chemicals are chemicals that would be stored, they are stored in your body's fat, it's possible that a woman who is having a child the child could be influenced by the chemicals stored in the mother's body, basically is the way it works. All right, so let's think a minute about the fish and how you decide what kinds of fish you would find acceptable to eat from the Hudson. Well, first, the bad news. There are fish in the Hudson that spend their entire adult life in the Hudson and maybe bottom feeders are getting toxic materials like PCBs from the food they're eating lower on the food chain. The food chain, as we go up the food chain, these chemicals concentrate so that if you're eating particularly a larger fish, an older fish, something that eats other fish, which makes it higher on the food chain, the likelihood of it being more contaminated is greater. And we can look at a list of what kinds of fish those would be. But there's good news, too, in that there are fish in the Hudson that spend very little time, actually, in the Hudson River. They come into the river to spawn, and then once they've hatched, they go out into the ocean and spend their entire adult life in the ocean. So they're only here for a very short time. Their exposure to the PCBs is very short. So fish like shad, in particular, and herring, which come in the spring during these runs, are virtually clean fish and are delicious. They're very good to eat, and many people along the Hudson do enjoy them.
Cara says the Department of Environmental Conservation does yearly studies on the fish in the Hudson to check the contamination levels.
Striped bass fishery is closed. The striped bass fishery in the Hudson and on Long Island is a very economically valuable species. And because of that, we know a great deal about it. It's been studied and studied and studied because it's a valuable species. And surveys are done by the Department of Environmental Conservation to determine what the PCB levels are on an annual basis. And And for striped bass, we have pretty good data. Many of the other species in the Hudson that are contaminated with PCBs, white perch, white catfish, eels, a lot of those species are as contaminated as the striped bass, or maybe even more contaminated than striped bass. But because they're not economically and commercially as important, we know less about them. Therefore, there is not an official closing of those fisheries. There are health advisories that are put out every year to alert people to the fact that it might not be advisable to eat those fish. Throughout most of New York State, you have to have a fishing license in order to fish, and that fishing license on the inside cover lists fish that you are not advised to eat. We don't have a fishing license on the Hudson. It's not a requirement. So the vehicle for people knowing about which fish they shouldn't eat really doesn't exist at this point. It's possible to get that list from either the Department of Environmental Conservation or from the Department of Health. And I think it's published once a year in the newspaper when it comes out in May.
Fish from the Hudson can be tasty, but Cara Lee says you have to use caution when selecting your meal.
We're certainly eager to promote a use of the Hudson River fisheries as long as it's safe. And the shad fishery is certainly a bountiful and important part of not only sort of Hudson River culture, but the what's available from the Hudson River. And but we also want to urge people to have caution about other species. Many people fish because they enjoy being out on the river, because it's a pleasant form of recreation that takes them outdoors and they can leave their other cares behind. But plenty of people fish because they want to put a meal on the table. And it's for those people that we want to make sure that they understand what risks could be associated with it. And like I say, it's a personal decision. It depends very much on who you are. If you're an 80-year-old man who's been eating fish all your life, your attitude is going to be different than someone who has a 3-year-old child. It's just a decision that people have to make for themselves, but it's possible to make a decision that's pretty informed.
After a species of fish that has a lower likelihood of contamination is selected, Cara cautions before you eat it there are ways to clean the fish to minimize the amount of contamination even more.
PCBs, as a chemical group, are attracted to fats. That's just a chemical reality. And so they accumulate in the fish, in the fatty parts of the fish. And so it's possible when you clean the fish to remove the skin and the belly flaps where the PCBs accumulate. And you end up with a fish that's, acceptably clean.
PCBs are said to be very harmful if taken in large doses. However, there are still many uncertainties about its effects.
These kinds of chemicals have different effects on different people, and some people may be, because of heredity, more susceptible to cancers. And it's very hard to sort out, given all the things that we're exposed to in the environment, what exactly causes it. But some people do have a greater susceptibility, and their bodies respond in a certain way that someone else's might not. It's not clear exactly what PCBs do because they don't do the same thing to every person. And the research and the literature that I've seen indicate that it may not be that PCBs directly cause cancer, but they sort of set the process up and are involved in the cancer, in cancers being formed, rather than actually causing the cancer themselves. But it's still an area which is poorly understood because it takes many years for the effects of PCBs to be seen in humans, and we're not mice. It's not easy to test what the effects are on humans.
The PCB contamination problem originated years ago when the General Electric Company released them into the water. Since then, alternative methods to get rid of those PCBs have been discussed by the state and environmental groups. One proposition is to dredge them out of the river, which we discussed in Logbook 32, you may remember. And Cara Lee says Scenic Hudson is in favor of that idea.
You could be exposed to PCBs in your drinking water source your whole life with a very limited likelihood of them having an effect on your health. But because PCBs bioaccumulate in the food chain, it's possible to eat a single fish that would give you a larger dose of PCBs than you would get by drinking water from the Hudson your entire life. So, in fact, it's through the fish that people get the greatest exposure to PCBs from the Hudson. So, since PCBs are still coming down from the upper river as the sediments get eroded down the river, we're very much in favor of the cleanup project being carried out. We understand that there are problems with the cleanup project because if the sediments get taken out of the river, they have to be put somewhere. But we believe that it makes more sense to contain them than to allow them to continue to be spread into the environment.
14-year-old Chris Lake is a young Hudson River fisherman who's quickly learning the tricks of the trade. Chris is going to demonstrate how to remove PCBs from a fish, but first he'll tell us how he got started.
Well, ever since I was like 4 years old or so, for about 10 years I've been doing this in the river, and my father introduced me when I was about 4. And you know, starting in the spring, we start with shad fishing, and then we go into, in the summertime, rod and reel fishing for needlefish and striped bass, into the late summer, crabbing and hunting in the fall. Like that, that's what we do.
Chris says he enjoys all types of activities on the river.
Oh, there's lots of things. I mean, ice fishing, the tributaries in the wintertime you can do. Sport fishing out on the river there's lots of other species like white perch, crevalle jack, summertime like that.
And now Chris will demonstrate for us how to cut out the PCBs.
For small fish like these, bluegills, pumpkin seed, I use a knife like this, about a 4-inch blade, flexible. For a bigger fish like a shad or a bass, you would use a knife about like this, you know, a larger blade. And for tough fish like sturgeon, you would use something like this, a short, really thick blade. And it's very important to have a sharp blade when you're doing this. So that's why I have this stone here, and that's very important. You start off making one cut right in back of the gill flap like that. Then, using mostly the tip of the knife, you go down the backbone of the fish like that. So you can hear it going along the backbone like that. Then, using mostly the tip, you try to peel it away from there like that. Get your finger under there and slowly bring it down like that. And you bring it down like this. Using mostly the tip of the knife. That's why it's important to have a sharp tip. Okay, and then once you get down to about the bottom of the fish, you just go along and cut it off like that. Then what you do, it's good to skin the fillet also. Skin the fillet like this. First of all, you'd start off cutting the belly flap off. That's where a lot of the toxins accumulate. Then you just make something that you can hold on to like that. And just bring it back off along the skin like that. There, and that's the finished fillet.
Chris's father, Tom Lake, is a member of the Hudson River Fishermen's Association.
Well, it's interesting. I've lived along the Hudson River all my life. I was born in Beacon, and I used to walk across the Fishkill Creek, a tidal tributary to the Hudson, every day on the way to school. And it was interesting that in those days, a lot of abuse was going on in the valley. A lot of toxins were being put in the water, and no one seemed to really notice. Fishkill Creek would run green one day and red the next, according to what kind of dyes were coming out of the factories. And it never really sunk in because the people around me in my environment were not reacting to it, so I didn't think enough to react to it. When I got out of the Army in 1969, I began to really get interested in the Hudson River and doing things on the river. So since 1969, I've been getting a little more active on the Hudson River each year with rod and reel fishing for shad and striped bass, and a lot of the other fish that are in the river that you can catch. And now my son and I, for the last 5 or 6 years, have been doing some commercial fishing with friends, and now this year we're going to start a venture of our own on the Hudson River. And we eat crab, and we, season by season, there's always something to do on the Hudson River, from duck hunting to ice fishing to crabbing to commercial fishing.
Tom says it would be extremely hard for a person to try to make a living by commercial fishing in the Hudson.
You used to be able to make a living on the Hudson River by marketing fish. You used to be able to catch eels and send them overseas. There was an export market on eels, which is no longer in effect. Blue crab, you can blue crab on the Hudson River, but it's not the kind of thing where you can catch enough to really commercially sell. Shad fishing is really the only thing left on the Hudson River that a person can halfway make a living out of, and even that will not keep you through an entire year. There's herring, blueback herring, rainbow smelt, a few other fish that you can legally harvest. But as far as commercially harvested species, it's pretty much sturgeon to a certain extent also, but pretty much shad. But a man cannot make a living on the river the way he could 30, 40 years ago. The fish are here, though, in tremendous numbers. We have millions and millions of shad and striped bass, and it's simply, it's really two things. The condition of the fish, which is not as bad as you'd probably expect from reading the media about the Hudson River. Perhaps the worst thing that we have to overcome on the Hudson is the people's perception of the Hudson River. And that perception is that it's for a lot of people believe it's a real nasty place and we shouldn't be eating fish out of it. And hopefully programs like this will, in some part, educate people that the fish are there and they can be eaten.
Tom says since the PCB contamination problem in the river, he's been selecting fish to eat.
Given the PCBs and their affinity to fish with high fat content, and in addition to that, fish that tend to be in the river for long periods of time, it takes an educated consumer to know what fish perhaps that he should be eating or not eating. If you look at fish that spend relatively small amounts of their life history in the Hudson River, such as the American shad, alewives, rainbow smelt, blueback herring, anadromous fish are what we call those. They're fish that live primarily in the ocean but return to freshwater to spawn. Those fish tend to have very, very low levels of PCBs, and therefore they can be consumed. There are fish which we consider native or estuarine species, fish that make spend most of their lives in the Hudson River, like the short-nosed sturgeon, which is an endangered species, but a lot of the catfish, the eels, and fish like this that spend long periods of time in the Hudson, they're generally fish that you should stay away from. But an educated consumer who has an idea of what types of fish that he wants to eat can pick and choose, and he can eat smelt, or she can eat shad roe, sturgeon, fish like this, herring, pickled herring in the springtime, pickled shad, smoked sturgeon. There's just all kinds of fish that can be eaten out of the Hudson River, but it's this overall perception that people have of the river when they read about PCBs, that we should not be eating the fish out of the Hudson, and again, that's not entirely accurate.
Tom says he's seen the river undergo many changes over the years, and he feels its future remains bright and hopeful.
But we have a couple things that are going for us right now, one of which is the PCB project, which the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and a lot of environmental groups like Clearwater and Hudson River Fishermen's Association are really pushing for. This project potentially can remove 10 tons of PCBs from the upper Hudson, of the perhaps 90 tons that remain above the dam right now. Whether or not this is the next 10 years worth that's going to come over the dam, or it's going to be 10 years at the end, which will be shortened, we don't really know. But it appears from what the health department tells us that we're going to be coming into a high flow. The next 10 or 15 years, we're going to have periods of high flow in the Hudson River, which says that if we don't start getting some of these out, they're going to wind up down here anyhow. So it's a good idea we're doing that. That will, in the long run, help reduce levels in fish. That is good from the consumer standpoint, that given that there's going to be people on the river that are going to eat fish no matter what. So this is good for those people. On the other hand, the perception part of the Hudson River, which I think is the biggest obstacle to overcome for both the commercial fishermen, the sport fishermen, people who use the Hudson River in any number of ways recreationally, is the perception. And as the fish become cleaner and more programs are had where people are being educated on what fish they can consume and how to go about preparing them, I think the perception that people will have of the Hudson River and its fish is going to greatly improve.
Get a pen and pencil handy, and we'll learn more about the types of fish one can eat from the Hudson River And the ways to clean out those PCBs, Tom tells us there is a booklet available.
The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has a very nice little pamphlet which they produce, which can be, you can actually send for it at Albany at the DEC headquarters, or you can send in this particular area here in Poughkeepsie, you can send to Region 3 in New Paltz, South Buck Corners Road. And it's a guide to, it's a consumer's guide to how to reduce toxics in fish. Again, we're dealing with fish that initially have a low incidence of PCBs or any toxin to begin with. We're not talking about how to take a white catfish or a yellow perch or an American eel and try to reduce it, because they potentially have got high levels to begin with. But how do you take a fish that is already considered to be a somewhat safe fish, like an American shad or a sturgeon, and further reduce the potential for toxics? And this particular handout will, this folder will allow you to, it'll demonstrate, it'll show you how to go about filleting that fish and skinning the fillet.
Well, there you have it, a choice. Eat it or just throw it back. Maybe you have some different thoughts, though, about it after watching young Chris Lake. Thanks for coming aboard this time. We'll be back again right here next week, same time and place, on the river.